Oh, maybe that's him. All right. Hello and welcome to tonight's meeting of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club. I'm your host this evening, Tobias Berblinger, and this is Janira Cardenas, and she's doing our audio and visual for us now. As attendees of the Hand-Eye Supply Curiosity Club, you now are all members, provided you adhere to our philosophy, ex curiositas scientia. We pledge to learn without prejudice in pursuit of our mutual goal, perpetual noviceship. We admit that it is impossible to know everything about anything, and thus we remain perpetually curious and perpetually novice. This is our flag and our mascot, Franklin. The lightning bolt represents the receipt of knowledge, the enlightenment of illumination, the resonance of truths understood. It awakens and excites us and makes us hungry for more. And now let's give a warm Curiosity Club welcome to Arnon Karmatsov of Bridgetown Forge.
Well, thank you all very much for coming. Well, before we plunge right into it, in case you're wondering why this guy is standing in front of you rather than someone else, so as mentioned, my name is Arnon. I run and own a little company called Bridgetown Forge. I've been in Portland for 12 years now. Before that, I lived in Japan for 12 years, where I was apprenticed to various nefarious smiths and such like. Before I was apprenticed there, I actually worked as a linguist. First a student and then, full-time linguist. And let it all be a lesson to us that just because you're really good at something doesn't mean you actually enjoy doing it at all. Okay, so I was good at what I did, I think, but languages come easily to me. But nevertheless, I enjoy smithing a whole lot than I enjoy working with languages. However, that approach, the linguistic approach, still kind of informs what I do to a certain extent. Second thing I wish to mention, how it's really disturbing if you have a person talking to you, they have a bit of spinach in their teeth, and you kind of don't quite know, shall I tell them, shall I not? It's kind of uncomfortable, so I just burned the tip of my nose. So in case you're wondering what this black spot on my nose is, that's what it is. So, because I had people come and say quietly, you have something on your nose. So I know, it's a burn. It will go away. The subject matter this evening is blacksmithing. So, what is blacksmithing? How shall we define it? Some people say, well, if you don't use this and this sort of equipment, very traditional one, then you're not really a smith, and people want you to stand under a chestnut tree and smite mightily and all that. So let me pass you some items. One item's been circulating here. So here, if you could just, do me a favor and pass these items around, and you can just look at them. Right, they're kind of nice to handle, I think. Not good to drop on the foot. All of them are kind of heavy. That's not my fault. It's just gravity. It likes metal. Pass them around. So, here's another one. So, as you can see, all of these items, they are quite different from each other. Right? They have different shapes, and you can figure out, even if you can't figure out their particular function, you can figure out, well, the probably different function, if any. And yet they all have one thing in common. They were made by a smith, me. All right, so from that we can go and try and define what smithing actually is. And smithing is manipulation of metal, usually, but not exclusively iron, or steel if you wish nowadays. And since iron and metal, it tends to be rather hard, we have to heat it up, right? So that's what a smith does. A smith normally heats up a piece of iron or steel and then manipulates. And there are only very few techniques, actually. You can hammer it and draw it out. You can thicken it. It's called upsetting. You can cut it or slit it. You can twist it, and you can punch it, and you can bend it. And that's about it. So we have like maybe 5 techniques, basic techniques, really, I think. My math is not that good. But just like with the language, we can have very few sounds and we can combine them to create vast amount of words. But the same token, if we have only these 5 or 6 techniques, we can combine them and they create an enormous amount of objects. Some of them can be useful. Here's another object, which please be careful with that. Careful with yourself, not with the object, because nothing is going to happen to it. It's I'll just show it before I pass it. It's a smithing hammer, right? I made a while back. It's a heavier hammer, right? It's a completely useful item. Or it can be something that is, its only function is to exist. It's basically a steel rose forged from 2-inch square bar of steel, single piece, no welds or anything like that. But I got a kick out of making this one. Or this little sculptural piece, which also done for another purpose that I felt like it. And of course you can already see the knives here. So this is blacksmithing, right? You can create a variety of shapes and you manipulate the metal when it's in its plastic state. So you heat it up. So we add to the craft, to understand the craft, we have the whole thing of fire, which pyromaniacs among us will appreciate. Right? It's very enjoyable to heat stuff in fire. And then it has the whole thing of rather physical, element, the physical manipulation of the metal. Hello there. Sorry. Not at all. No. You haven't missed anything. So these two elements. Now, what blacksmithing actually produces, as you see from this object that I'm passing around here, it doesn't really matter from my perspective. It's all the same, whether I'm making a sculptural piece, or whether I'm making a hammer for myself, or whether I'm making a knife. It doesn't really matter a whole lot, right? Because basically it's the same. You heat the metal, and then you have a short window of opportunity to affect whatever changes you want. So, that window of opportunity is not very large, right? If you're an individual smith, you have a limit to your equipment, therefore you have a limit to how big the piece of steel can be. And the smaller the piece, the less time it will remain hot. So it's a strange craft that combines, quite a bit of patience. When you heat your steel up, you just kind of stand there and stare and don't do anything much, And then when it's out, and it's hot, you work, ferociously, basically beating on it like a maniac, trying to squeeze that few blows, into that little window of opportunity that we have. Because you try to minimize the amount of times you heat the metal, especially if you do knives and tools and such. And I have to admit that I really like making tools, making good, high quality, very functional and beautiful tools. So that's kind of the general outlook. Another peculiar thing about smithing is that it combines the logical, right? The steps in forging something are very logical. You don't just beat on it until kind of something happens. You have to figure out beforehand very clear steps how to achieve the end result. At the same time, it's very visceral, because once the steel is out, you can't really engage that logical faculty fully. It's quite visceral. You have to react instantaneously to how the metal moves, because it never moves logically exactly, because our bodies never move exactly, the way a machine would, even if you work with a machine. So it's constant kind of self-observation and self-correction at the same time. You have to know a fair amount of metallurgy and machinery, building, and math, and that sort of thing. So that's basically, I think, is for many people, myself included, is the fascination. You have these two really opposites, right? The placid waiting in front of the forge, just staring into it. I wonder how many awful poems got written during that time, And on the one hand, on the other hand, this kind of ferocious activity of actually hammering and bending and cutting, the urgency of it all, and then the intellectual, if you wish, pursuit, and then the visceral one, and then of course the careful planning ahead, and the knowledge that you require, versus some sort of artistic, if you wish, endeavor. If you do sculptural pieces, you really want things to look good, because if you forge something and it doesn't look good, you really should just quit, because what's the purpose, right, of that? Unless we're talking about industrial forging. So that's the background. Now, when we say a blacksmith, now I spend a lot of time in Japan, and my chief specialty nowadays is Japanese chef's knives and woodworking tools as well, but mostly knives. I spend a lot of years doing big architectural steelwork, like really big things, and I just completed actually probably my last architectural project for, till the end of my days, I think. So I specialize in these things nowadays, kind of burn out on big things. But when we say smith in the West, a blacksmith, and we say a blacksmith in Japan, which is where the thrust of the rest of my talk is going to be, we mean two different things, really. Here, blacksmith often is associated with, shoeing horses, and which I don't do, as they say, the front end of the horse bites and the back end kicks, so. And so, no, I don't shoe horses, and I think both the horses and me are grateful for that. But that's a farrier, actually, to be precise with, phraseology. We can just grab it. Yeah, we'll talk about this a little bit later, if time allows. So, but a smith can make a gate, a railing, or things of that nature as well. Maybe a piece of furniture. We have a lot of work like this in Europe, more than in this country, of course. In Japan, almost none of this exists. There are people in Japan who make the very specific smiths. They make temple hinges and decorations and things of that nature. But even to this day, there are very few of them left. But in Japan, mostly when you say a blacksmith, it means a knife maker or a chisel maker or an axe maker, some sort of tool maker, in short. Like maybe they can specialize and make this really high quality, plates. Have you seen those plates? The one that's shaved like paper thin piece of wood shaving, yards long in one pass. You've seen those probably, right? So there are specialists who do that. So let's talk a little bit about first knives in general, and then how the Japanese, look at that whole thing. And nowadays, people have Japanese knives. How many of you have a Japanese knife at home? Wow. Yeah, that's quite a lot. Alrighty, where do you normally go to buy a Japanese knife? Online?
Chinese supermarket.
Chinese, okay. Any other?
Cutlery store.
Cutlery store, right. Online maybe, right. Many sources, right? Nowadays, that wasn't the case, 15 years ago, even, right? I don't think. So Japanese knives became popular, very popular, and sometimes they're imitations without really understanding the essence of them, but that's a different story. Okay, we have a knife. What do we want from a knife? Fundamentally, yeah.
Something that you use to cut something.
Yeah, something you cut with. Very simple.
It's blunt.
Yeah, it should not be blunt. So it's you're exactly right. I think there's a very famous sword maker in Japan, not the one I was apprenticed to, another one, much more famous, Yoshihara Yoshindo, and he said something very simple and very Japanese. He says a Japanese sword is beautiful because it's sharp. It's like really very Japanese. And what does he mean by that? Of course, Russians said it a different way. They said an airplane it will only fly if it's beautiful. It came out in the 60s, I think. Yeah.
Form follows function.
Exactly, form follows function, absolutely. So the beauty of a Japanese sword is not because it has carvings or gold or decorations or anything like that. It's a very simple shape. And once when I was at a British museum years ago, there was a display that very simple, just the sword, no explanation, no words, nothing, naked, no scabbard, no handle, just the bare sword on a piece of white cloth. And every single person who walked by did a double take. It's just something very beautiful about this form because it's completely functional. Every single part of it is. So a knife has to be sharp. Now, okay, so let's say we have here, some sort of common shape. Western knife looks kind of like this more often than not. That's what we associate with it. So it's made out of, what is a knife made of? Yeah.
Metal and wood.
Sure, but metals, there are many metals. I mean, mercury is a metal too, right?
Yeah.
So particular kind of metal.
Tool metal or this one?
Okay, steel.
On steel.
Yeah, okay, steel. All right, so iron. You're right, because steel is mostly iron. That's absolutely true. And what we do to make iron, which is an element, right? Iron is an element, right? It's very soft, actually. It's very ductile. So we add a little bit of carbon to it, small percent of carbon, and what we get is a steel. Okay, it's very simple, really. Of course, it's not quite as simple because it's very narrow range. You know, if you go below and above that narrow range, it will not be steel. And if you want the steel to be stainless, we add some chromium, over 13% chromium, and it will be stainless. What's called stainless, right? So we'll go to that better into this later. So, okay, so we have steel, and steel has this really interesting quality. It can exist at different levels of hardness. Exactly the same composition. Let's say 99% iron and 1% carbon. We mix it up, all right? And it can be very hard, so hard it snaps, or it can be quite flexible, like a car spring. And what does this is heat treatment. Another thing that a knife maker does, right? So what we have here, we have a knife. And we heat treat it and quench it. We've probably seen it, maybe, or heard or read about it, or maybe done it yourself. You heat up your knife, your tool, and you plunge it into water or oil. Usually that's what you use, or brine. And it cools down rapidly from red hot, to room temperature in 2 seconds or so, less. And you have a very hard knife. You've probably seen, at least some of you, seen it in a movie or something, right? Like Lord of the Rings or one of those things, right? That's anyhow. So, and it's all hardened, right? And it's hard. It's very hard, like a glass. We need to reduce that hardness a little bit. But the point is that if all of the knife is really hard, it's also very brittle. It's So what we have a compromise. We have to make it a little softer. It's called tempering. You reheat it to a much lower heat than before, just a little bit. And the harder it gets, the softer it will get, and the more flexible it will be. So we compromise. If the knife will have the same hardness everywhere, right, at every point of the blade, well, then we have to compromise. You don't have to. Here's what the Japanese did. They said, let's do something like this. Let's take a chunk of steel. Here's a chunk of steel. Right? Let's pretend. Okay, some sort of soft steel. Can't really harden it, right? And then what we'll do, we'll cut it. We'll get it hot, and we'll take a chisel, and we'll slice it open like that. Okay? And then what we'll do, we'll take another piece of steel, but much higher percentage of carbon, something that will become really hard, okay? And let's put it right inside this first piece of steel. Well, just like that. Okay? And then what we'll do, we'll heat it up together in a forge. Forge is where the smith heats the metal. It can be a coal forge, a gas forge, oil forge even. There are many kinds, doesn't really matter. And we fuse it together. It's called forge welding. And we keep hammering on it and stretching it until we have this sort of scenario, some sort of knife shape. See that? Now, you see the jacket is very soft steel, will never harden. What's inside is very hard steel. When we quench it, only the inside will harden. And then when we temper it, we can leave it much, much harder than anything else. And it will never shatter, because the outside layer will protect it, will flex, and it will not break. Within certain, reasonable limits, you can break anything, right? So, and why is it good to have such a hard edge?
Stays sharp.
Yes, it stays sharp much longer, because the young gentleman here defined for us what a knife is. It's something that stays sharp, something that cuts. So a knife that survives the dishwasher and all that sort of thing, that's very nice, but if it doesn't cut, it's not a knife, by our own definition. Okay, so that's one possibility. Another possibility is to create what the Japanese really like doing, is a single bevel knife. This is the conventional Western knife. And this is what lots of Japanese knives look like in cross section. Is it clear? All right. This is the cross section. So what we do, we take a piece of soft steel, and we take a piece of really high carbon, nice steel. All right. Oh, anyways, okay, thank you. Yeah, I have more goodies here. If somebody wants to circulate them. Here. I forgot to mention, it's very unpolitic for me to say. You know, somebody who lectures never should say I forgot. Anyhow, I forgot to mention that one of the joys of smithing is that you make a lot of your own tools. You just invent them. Some of them have no names. You just make them up on the go. Okay, and you have to. Because what happens, you take a piece of steel, right? Here I make a piece of steel, I hammer it out, suddenly it's different shape. If I had some foresight, I had tongs pre-made. If not, I have to drop it, made a pair of tongs, because I'm going to pick it up now. The previous tongs no longer fit, right? So that's part of the joy. Anyhow, back to the previous subject. I take the soft steel and the hard steel, and I fuse it together, and I hammer it out, hammer, 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 hammer. Okay, stretch, 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 stretch. And what I have here is single bevel knife, you see? Like this. It's right-handed in this case, right? Steel facing this way, and I sharpen it on this side. Okay, by the way, for most applications, single bevel knife will outcut double bevel, hands down. So, as an example, oops, I will not pass this one around, which might occur to you. So here's a large single bevel fish knife. Works great on meat too. This is oversized on there a little bit. So you can you see this line here? Yeah, is it clear? So this line is what separates the steel from the iron, basically, from the mild steel, right? Hard from soft, right? So most of this surface is hard steel. Think of it as some sort of a ham sandwich, right? The ham being this thin ham, being the the hard steel, right? And then you turn the sandwich on the side. I'm really stretching the metaphor here. Turn the sandwich actually on this side, right? You cut you know what I mean, right? So the hard steel is actually a very thin layer, and it's really very hard, much harder than a conventional Western style knife will ever go to, right? So it will keep its edge like crazy, and at the same time, this is carbon steel, so it will be very easy to resharpen. It's a contradiction. People think that just because something is very hard, that it's hard to resharpen. That's not necessarily true. Also, people think that if something is really wear resistant, it means it will keep an edge for a long time. That's also not true. Right? So there's steels that are not very wear resistant, therefore you can sharpen them quickly, but they'll keep an edge much longer than some, very wear resistant steels. It's weird, but there's mechanics which we'll not go into right now. And you can see the line here as well, I think, right? That's the other side, right? Because the thick soft steel is ground from this side. You can see how it's a single bevel knife. Did you see that? Yeah. I'm tempted to pass it around, but I won't. All right? So we have a single bevel knife. And single bevel knife is really good for things like fish and meat and, sometimes for vegetables as well. Depends on the knife. So, for example here, this is a particular kind of fish knife. It's called takokiri. It's for cutting octopus, okay, specifically, right? And it's sashimi knives are made the same way, right? So, with just pointy, right? So when you make sashimi, say, out of octopus, usually you'll be using something like this. And here's another one. This is a professional grade vegetable knife, single bevel. You can already see that. Right? You see the steel here and the steel here protruding, so that means it's a single bevel. This is professional grade. The edge is so fragile it will flex under my fingertip. Right? It's paper thin, so if somebody's not used to that, it's not a cleaver. It's for cutting chicken bones. It's for slicing. You ever seen Japanese chefs holding this daikon radish and cutting this seemingly endless, strip out of it? Yeah, that's what they use. Other tools just can't hack it. So, coming a little bit of a full circle, why Japanese knives? Simply put, they tend to outperform Western knives. They're, I think, much better designed. For example, the Western knives have usually this big upswept part. For the life of me, I don't know why it's there, because logically, to use this, if I were like upswept, I would have to bring this in touch with my foot, I have to bend my wrist, which is a very weak position. And mostly what you use when you cut is actually this part, right, of a knife, that's slicing, right? So why not, you know, do what the Japanese do, just bring it down and have maybe a very slight belly to it, so you can rock it if you want. I really don't know why this design exists. Also, usually they have bolsters. If you keep grinding your knife, what happens is that you have this scenario after a while. And that means that this part of the knife will never touch the board, therefore it will not touch your food. So you even further reduce it using just the front of the blade. Another thing is that the Western knives, traditional Western knives, they tend to have much thicker blades. You know, a good Japanese knife will have this sort of scenario. Hang on a second if I can open it without causing a disaster. Alright, so see, it will be ground from here, narrow, wide. Right, so the tip, of course, turns down. So when you cut, you know, don't have to bend your wrist. The wrist is straight all the way to the, you know, it's one line basically, right, from your wrist and, you know, and the knife. And there's no bolster, so it will never have this potential of riding off the board. And because this is wide, it's also very thin. This is for thin stuff, and this is, you know, short bevel, narrow bevel. So this is for cutting heavy stuff, heavy stock. So in one knife, you get this thing. You can cut very delicate things. The blade here is really very thin, and you can cut pretty thick stuff. In Western knives, they don't have this scenario. Right? This is really.
Sorry,
Yeah.
the single or double?
This is single bevel. Right? So this is, for example, for cutting salmon. If you get a whole salmon, you want to fillet it, that's what I use. Right? It works really well for that. So you can do delicate work if you want to, like, you know, snack on a little sashimi right after you cut your salmon. Right? So you can do that. Just, you know, and, you know, if you want to chop the head off, then this part will go right through it. So this, I think, is probably one of the reasons that, or some of the reasons that Japanese knives have become so popular. They use carbon steel rather than stainless, much easier to sharpen, will stay sharper longer, generally speaking. They are very well designed in terms of the just usability. They're ground much thinner. They never completely industrialize their knives, in the sense that still to finish a knife properly in Japan, usually there's a guy with a big wet wheel, you know, like a 3-foot diameter, you know, Waterstone, and it will be like, you know, not necessarily a guy, there's some women actually, you know, who do that as well. But there will be a person who, you know, puts that really extra thin edge on the knife and makes sure the geometry is 100%. If you make it completely automated, you will never be able to do that. You'll have to compromise. You have to make the edge thicker, you know, and that's the difference. So I think that probably accounts for the popularity. How are we time-wise? Don't wish to keep you here. You know, we good? Yeah. Good. Okay. So this is basically how it is. Now there are many regional differences in Japan. You know, that's one of the joys of knife making. You know, in Japan, you go to some region and they have their own, you know, little knives for fish or vegetable or mackerel and eel and I don't know what else, right? And knives, you know, that are just historically, you know, developed this particular way in this particular region. And you ask them why we do this. It says, well, because we do it like that, you know. So grandpa did it this way and it works well, so I'm going to do it that way too. At the same time, there's a lot of innovation. Right, and that's going on. People experiment all the time, kind of keep the old, but they're quite happy to mess around with the new. There's fewer and fewer of those smiths, I have to say, for a variety of reasons. But the place where I studied, Sakai City, it's part of Osaka nowadays. It's still very much around. You walk around and you can hear, you know, the power hammers going, and you know. People just hitting the anvils and can smell the, you know, the coal in the air. So coke, rather, I should say, not coal. and so on and so forth. You can find really high quality Japanese knives in the States nowadays, although sometimes they're not exactly authentic and often made for us. The round eyes, that is the ground kind of a little thick because they know we'll mess it up. So, not all the time, but often it's like that. And it's true, you have to be raised with that. So, from my perspective, I use Japanese knives in my kitchen. So from my perspective, a little extra care, if you have a carbon steel blade, you have to prevent it from rusting, is well worth it. So you can. I cook a lot, so you can get outstanding performance out of something that just requires a little extra care in return. Okay, I think basically I outlined what it is that I do. A couple of other things. I also work a lot with stainless steel. I have to say that because I passed around this here poker, and this is forged stainless steel, and I use it as some sort of illustration. How you can make a better tool. A while back I made a poker for my own house, and this is not a perfect poker or anything. And I had a poker that I made, a traditional one is a split point poker. And I found it extremely irritating although I made it, every time a log rolls against the wall, you're kind of stuck. You can't reach it, right? Because that split point, hits the wall, and the log is here. So the very tool that's designed to ease your life actually makes you go mad. And people often just, everywhere. I can see people that reverse it and do this, So it's kind of maddening. Of course, nowadays they're also made from two parts, which and it's kind of disturbing. You do this kind of action, and the handle starts unscrewing. And because it's two parts. So this is forged from a solid piece, you see. And the way you make your tool, you have to make it, achieve some sort of balance as much as possible. So you have to have the handle on the heavy side, right? Because this is a very long leverage, so you need to balance it out a little bit. It could have been a little heavier, actually. It was kind of experimental. And why have the split point at all? This basically is a blacksmithing tool for manipulating coal. So this works as a poker, right, to moving logs. This is for manipulating the coals that fall down, right? And it's forged from one thick piece, thinned out, so it will never unscrew itself, and it's balanced. So what I'm trying to say is they can always make a better tool, even something as mundane, straightforward, and something we've seen a gazillion times as a fire poker. And of course, this is stainless, so it will never develop this annoying layer of rust that pokers develop because of the ashes. They're quite corrosive, right? So that's basically where I come from in smithing. Taking something very simple, mundane, like a bottle opener or a fire poker, and making it into something better and hopefully, a little special. Any questions? Yeah, please.
You said you did a little bit of woodworking tools. Could you elaborate on that?
I'm sorry, did it work with what?
Woodworking tools?
Yeah, I make chisels. I make chisels and a certain amount of axes, woodworking axes, and adzes on occasion. Adze is probably my most favorite tool. Not a whole lot of coal for adzes. Most people don't know what an adze is. So there are a couple of large carving chisels here, single piece construction, which is kind of one of my specialties. The knives here, you can welcome to look at them later. They're all single piece construction. So I do that. I learned a bit of that in Japan as well. Yes?
What do you do for surface finishing, like on steel or stainless?
Polishing, just polishing. That's one thing about knives. You make knives, you have to polish them a lot. Grind them and then do a good surface finish. So I like leaving forged surfaces on my knives, but this is only the surfaces that don't come in touch with food. Because sometimes you see a forged knife and just the very edge is kind of ground, and the rest of it is kind of rough forged. This will never work well. It will not just slide through your food. So you kind of leave the forged look because I love it, but where it touches the food, it has to be completely functional. Again, a knife is beautiful, a sword, if you wish, beautiful because it's sharp. So which means it has to cut. So a long process of polishing. The most boring part of it. Yes.
Tell us about the Mongo cleaving.
Oh, the Mongo cleaver. Yes, this is actually, I made this cleaver. To my shame, I haven't completed it yet. I made it for my Kung Fu teacher. Okay, he once asked him if I could make him something. I says, I want a big cleaver. And I says, he's a big guy. So I says, you got it. So I made two, one right-handed and left-handed, just to see how it works out. So the right-handed worked out. Now I just have to finish this one. This is already heat-treated. Just has to be messed around with a little bit. And yeah, this is a big left-handed cleaver. He's left-handed, so yeah. So that's the story. Usually I make them a little smaller and a little lighter, but I think in his case I kind of went overboard. This is really just splitting a hog into. Yes.
When you're forging together hard and soft steel, what holds it together?
Go ahead. I'm sorry, I interrupted you.
Is it like welding or something?
Yes, it's exactly like welding. Although when you arc weld, the metals are molten, right? You melt the metals together. But with forge welding, it's a little different. You raise the temperature, but it's below the actual melting temperature. So when you raise it to a certain temperature, the metals will fuse together, right? It's just if you keep the surfaces clean, they will just fuse. Okay, and you could do it even with stainless steel. That's trickier. You hit them. You don't have to hit them hard. You can squeeze them in a press, or you just tap them, and it wants to fuse. These two pieces will just melt into each other. That's how Damascus steel is made, by the way, if you know that name. You just fuse a whole bunch of metals together and then manipulate it and create, patterns, Like if I were to do this, two different metals, and I would, let's say, twist it, right, and then hammer it flat again, and then, fold it and twist it again. Eventually I will generate some sort of, it's just the beginning of it, a primitive, some sort of pattern. And then I'll etch it and the different metals will stand out. Yeah?
You mentioned that the single bevel cuts better than double bevel. I was curious why that is.
Well, think of a chisel. Chisel is always single bevel, right? Woodworking chisel, right? I'm kind of cheating here because it's a simile. But what happens is, do we have time to go into detail? I don't want to keep you guys because I'm sure you have things to do, people to kill, that sort of thing. So let's say that we have double bevel. By the way, don't misunderstand me. In Japan, they also have, double bevel knives, and I do make double bevel knives. Just if you make a double bevel for, veg, say, you just better make sure it's really ground very thin, and then it will work very well for veg. For meat, I feel that a single bevel, no matter what, works better. But okay, so let's say we have a single bevel knife, and let's say that in the West normally the knives are like this, right? There's this. You can see fairly thick bevel at the end, right? The secondary bevel, right? This comes from the fact that it's ground on a belt usually. It's very fast to do, and then you just put a razor edge on this edge, and once this edge is gone, you're pushing something fairly thick. And this is the last bit, the law of diminishing returns almost. But you have to grind all of this off to create a good cutting tool. And this is tricky to do. This is very tricky to do by machinery. It's tricky to do by hand. You have to have something better than a grinding belt. Best thing is to have the 3-wheel diameter water wheel, stone, and the slowly rotating stone. And in Japan, they still make them and use them. And here we used to, and we just plain forgot. We used to make right here in this country, and of course in Europe as well, we used to make double layer and triple layer tools. I have scissors and axes and hatchets and cleavers that were made using this technique, and they were not made by hand, they were machine made. We used to know this, and now I can't find a single steel worker who knows that we used to do that. It's ridiculous, but it's true. Once the technology is gone, it's gone. Nobody even remembers it ever existed. But then again, I don't remember what I did yesterday, so why should I, So anyhow, I digressed a little bit from your question here, but let's say that we have this, very well-made knife with very small secondary bevel, not like a beefy one, and I cut a piece of something with it. Okay, so here's what I get, right? Here's the whatever I sliced off, right? So I get this angled slice. But often, whether you conscious of it or not, you want to make a straight cut. So to make a straight cut, you have to angle your knife, you see. It's logical, right? You have to angle your whole blade if you want a straight cut now. Right? The whole blade is angled. Right? Why angle it? Just make a blade angle. Right? So, this is slightly concave here, so basically it touches mostly with the leading cutting edge. Yeah, I'll get to it in a sec, yeah. And with the back of it, where the foot is basically already cut, right? So the surface mostly doesn't really touch anything, you see? So it separates it nicely and cleanly, and you get a nice even cut again and again and again, no matter what you cut. So this is why this is a superior edge. Now, if you grind the knife really thin, it makes almost no difference. But then you have to make it really very slightly, kind of like that. Very slightly, microscopically almost. Because then otherwise it will stick. Your foot will stick to it. So you have to create the separation of the food. Air has to enter there somewhere. So you have to grind it, what they call in Japanese hamaguri. Clamshell, very slight clamshell. And this is tricky to do by hand or any other way. So just make it single bit. Yes.
Would it be effective to have a really sharp tip,
Right.
but also have multiple tips on that?
Also have a what? I'm sorry.
So there's a tip, but there's also multiple tips on it.
You mean like teeth?
Yeah.
Well, often tooth knives are sold. I mean, I've made some and I sharpened some. They're sold as you never need to sharpen it. And it's like they say, what's the difference between a frog that you throw in a boiling pot of water and a frog that you put in cold water and then switch on, the heat. It's got a brutal image, but you know what the difference is? The frog that you throw in boiling water survives, and one that you boil kind of slowly doesn't, because it swims around and says, well, getting a little hot, I can stand it, right? And eventually it's too late. The frog that falls in boiling water says, man, this is hot, I'm out, right? It jumps out. So the serrated edge, you cut and you cut and you cut and you cut. And what happens is that you just don't notice it doesn't really cut anymore as well it used to, And then you say, okay, I'll sharpen it. And how the heck are you going to sharpen that? Exactly, So I don't like serrated edges, even on bread knives, because the amount of crumbs that they generate is just insane. Well, why? Just have a nice sharp. This will cut bread all day long, and minimum amount of crumbs. And I paid for the crumbs. When I was apprentice to this smith, I was apprentice as a blacksmith in Jerusalem. I lived in Israel for a while, right? This is the last living blacksmith in Jerusalem. He was a cranky old bugger, and he, I was filing a lot of steel, like really old style, filing a lot of steel, and he came to me and says, "You're only using the center of the file, I notice." I says, "It's more efficient." He says, "Yeah, maybe, but I paid for all of the file, from here to here, so just use all of it, all the teeth. You're using only like 70%, So by the same token, I buy a really nice loaf of bread and I, take a serrated knife and I look at it like, good Lord, it's like a big pile of crumbs, So, yeah.
Would an straight edge be good for chopping a tree down?
You mean teeth?
Yeah.
No, they're different teeth for cutting. That's a different subject, by the way. Japanese pull saws, which I think you have some. And hands down, really, Japanese pull saws, they cut twice as fast as any Western handsaw, traditional Western handsaw. They just do, okay, for a variety of reasons. So yeah, but the teeth for knives, they're kind of different. They're rounded, So the reason for them, but they don't really work long term. They don't really work all that well. So.
Do you sharpen it kind of like a chisel? Do you just sharpen it on one side when you resharpen?
Mostly, yes, because you don't want to create a secondary bevel here. You sharpen it mostly on this side, and then when you're almost done, you put it down flat on a very fine stone and just run it flat down. And, that takes the burr off, if everybody knows what a burr is, and then you get your razor edge. Yeah, it's very fast to sharpen. And if you need to regrind, mostly what you remove is soft iron. So it's a pleasure to do that as well, very fast. Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, you were wondering why Western knives had the point on them, and I did read somewhere that it had something to do with the fact that the fork actually made quite a late entry into eating traditions in Europe.
Yeah,
so
so-
the fork was what
Yeah.
you used to like
Right.
stab food and pick
Right.
it up.
Right.
And so they developed a point. I believe that might be why it's
Yeah.
a
Oh,
tradition.
many Japanese knives also, most of them have a sharp point. But you know, I think in the West they often put a chunk of meat in the mouth and cut it off like that, right? So which is kind of heart stopping as far as I'm concerned. You know, I don't know, like you would think that people with long noses would just die out. But, yeah, but anyhow, yeah, I don't really know. Anyway, that I know why in Japan they use the pull saw. And it exists, as far as I know, only in Japan. In Korea it's push saw. In China it's push saw. In Japan it's pull saw. And people come with all ridiculous explanations like, oh, well, they have mostly softwoods in Japan. It's, well, they have hardwoods in Japan. They have oak, they have elm. Yeah.
I've noticed I've used one a little bit, and one thing I've noticed that I like about it is that it's so thin.
Yeah.
And if you have a push saw,
Yeah,
you try and you can pull a Japanese saw as hard as you want.
That's exactly right. If we have a piece of paper, say, right? If I push it, it will bend. But if I pull it, it's actually quite strong. I cannot tear it up like this even, right? So that's the logic. If you pull it, you know, and the teeth are pointing towards you, you can exert quite a lot of force. And since the saw is half as thick, the curve will be, you know, half as thick. So the amount of wood you're removing is half. So it cuts much fast. And of course the teeth are much more vicious, you know. So why, I mean, it's so simple. Why didn't it occur to anyone else? So the reason, the conclusion for me there is that, you know, well, just because something exists and has existed for 1,000 years doesn't mean that, you know, it should continue or it's the best thing. Because sometimes, you know, this theory about the baboon with the injured hand. There's a alpha baboon in a herd of baboons, or whatever they call it, flock, school, gaggle, I don't know what they call. And it has an injured hand, right? And they're very dominant creatures. So it eats. It can only grab food in a certain way, like this, maybe. I don't know, right? You can only hold it maybe like that, right? So the young baboons imitate this baboon because it's the most dominant baboon. Maybe they get slapped around if they don't. I don't know. Okay, so they imitate this baboon, and before you know it, the next generation, they all eat like this. And if some other baboon tries to eat like that, so, and after a few generations, they all do that, and you come and ask them, why are you, you know, and it says tradition. And maybe there's even a religion based on that. I don't know. You know, some sort of, you know, convoluted reasoning. You know, you explain why this is best, or we serve the Father of all things, or I don't know why. It's like, well, you know, I don't know why. Yeah.
You talked about quenching and water or in oil. What's the difference?
Water is faster. So it's basically it goes by steel. Some steels are designated oil quench, and some steels are designated water quench, because apart from carbon, we can add a whole bunch of other things in the steel. Chromium, for example, tungsten, vanadium. In general, when you buy a knife, you know, stainless steel knife, often it says chromium, vanadium, tungsten, or nickel. And you go like, wow, chromium, vanadium, wow, I can't even pronounce the damn thing, and so that must be why it's so expensive. So here's the dough and give me the knife, I'm getting something. So the question that you have to ask yourself is, what are these things doing there? And some of them, small percentages, they actually make the heat treatment easier. Some steels can be hardened in air, for example, which is very nice, and so on and so forth. Not necessarily, you know, some of them, like high percentage of chromium, makes the steel stainless. But a lot of these additions or additives, they make, bless you, the manufacturing easier for me as the manufacturer. They don't add anything to the performance of the knife or your joy of using it. You know, it just makes it a little easier for me. So, you know, and I make you pay for that. So it's very clever marketing. So basically, a lot of ingredients in steel usually means, you know, you don't really need that many ingredients. The best stainless steel for knives, I think one comes from Sweden, one comes from Japan. I think it's the best in terms of cutting performance and edge retention and ease of sharpening. It's very simple steel, very pure iron, certain percentage of carbon and chromium, and that's it. Very simple. Okay, but if you take, for example, carbon steel, right? So iron and carbon, and you add just a little bit of chromium, suddenly you can quench it in oil. And before that, if it's a big, thick piece of steel, you can't really quench it in oil. It's too slow. It won't harden. The hardening will be very shallow. Like, for example, this big hammer here. I don't know where it went. Somebody has it was inside here. Oh yeah, here it is. Okay, so this one here is alloy steel. So it has some carbon in it and it has some chromium, right? So that means it's deep hardening. So I could harden this whole thing reasonably in oil. Okay, and it will harden sufficiently. The depth of penetration of the hardness will be such that, you know, the surfaces will be hard, and I can use it as a tool, right? And so on and so forth. But this hammer was hardened in water. It's a Japanese style knife maker's hammer, by the way. It's a weird looking tool. And this is plain carbon steel, was hardened in water because in oil it just wouldn't penetrate sufficiently. Did I answer it?
Yes.
Okay.
Where do you source your steel?
I'm sorry, a source. The Japanese steel, I still have a big stash from Japan. I can get more if I need to. And I can buy it online. There are companies that are happy to ship. There are some good tool steels. There's not much in town. In town, you only buy tool steels that are for making tools, my own tools. Very specific tools, like, for example, this chisel here. It's hot work tool steel. This means I can cut hot steel and it will not soften. It will not anneal. Right? So specifically for that, it's called H13. You can buy it in town. But mostly I get it from out of town.
Yeah. I've heard about folding iron back on itself
Yeah.
and then pounding it and
Yeah.
folding it.
Yeah.
What does that do? Does that just get the hardness through
Nothing.
the hole? It doesn't do anything.
Doesn't make anything. No, I'm just being snotty. I was apprenticed to a sword maker in Japan, and what they do is they get this steel and iron. It's called tamahagane. It's smelted using charcoal, very traditional method. Used to exist in Europe as well. It's used to be the only way of producing iron and steel. And it's not homogeneous. It looks like a sponge. It has lots of impurities. And what you do is you heat it up and fold it onto itself, just like you say, make a bar out of it, fold it, cut it, fold it, cut it. What it does is homogenizes it, squeezes out the impurities, and makes the percentage of carbon evenly distributed throughout the matrix of that, chunk of steel or iron or whatever it is that you're making. Now, if you do it many times and then you polish it very well and etch it, you'll see a very subtle kind of pattern in it. You see that in Japanese swords. It's not Damascus. In Damascus, on the contrary, you don't want to homogenize it too much. If you make Damascus steel, you want the different steels to stand out. All right? So you take steels with a different percentage of carbon, say, and so on, or you can use nickel even, you can laminate it and twist it. But if you keep cutting and twisting, two things will happen. A, you'll have no carbon left at all. Okay? And B, it will be so homogenized you won't see any pattern. So if you do it too much, so people say it's folded thousands of times. It's not folded thousands of times. It's just it multiplies, right? You have 2 layers, right? And then you have 4 layers, and so you stack them up, and you get 1,000 layers real fast. Okay, with just a few folds. So I did a couple of knives out of cable, like lifting cable. It's good steel. You can mess around with that and make knives, and they cut well. But I decided to laminate them, a couple of them, on them themselves. And the last knives that I made, they look just like regular steel. And it was all welded up, and it looked good. It cut well, but there's no pattern. It was so subtle as to, somebody said it. I hope there are no Brits here to be insulted, but a Brit said it, actually. So the British intelligence service mounts operations of such vast subtlety as to be practically non-existent. So that's exactly what I did. I created a pattern that was so subtle that it was non-existent. So, yeah. Any questions?
Do you have any favorite metalworking centers in the world?
Metalworking centers?
Yeah, like you were mentioning about how in Japan, the hinges and stuff like that.
Well, I'm not familiar with that many metalworker centers. I know that Germany is a big place for terrific smiths. Britain is a great place. There's some really outstanding smiths operating out of Britain. I mean, I haven't met them in person so much, but I saw the work, and some of it is just completely breathtaking. You know, just the guts of these guys. You know, some German smiths are like that too. And one of my main teachers for anything that not to do with knives is Yuri Hoffi of Israel. And he's a story in and of himself. I mean, he's internationally very well known. He trains all over the world, although kind of getting along in the tooth now. So when he became a smith, there were like I think 3 smiths living in Israel. Now there are maybe like 50. Most of them are his students. So like that. I made this during years and years ago when I took a course with him. Right. So this little ornamental piece. Yeah, Japan, of course, and there's lots of really talented smiths right here in Japan, and one of them, in the States, and one of them standing right here. This guy. Raise your hand. Yeah.
He's also a former Curiosity Club speaker as
well. So there you go then. All right, so that's about it. I don't know what else to add. Questions? Yeah.
What's next? Like, where do you see this going?
Well, my personal case or smithing in general?
I guess your personal case.
My personal case. Well, I really think that you can't exhaust this field, is what I'm saying. It's really, I can start messing around with Damascus for the next 20 years. And I like, what I call junk Damascus that's made from random pieces and kind of fuse them together. And it's not necessarily for knives, although you can forge weld a really good known steel edge to it and it will be a terrific knife and a completely wild pattern. So I will probably be making a lot of forged blades, probably going towards production lines more or less, like maybe 5-6 kinds of knife with some custom work. Woodworking tools for sure, sculptural pieces, which is most joyous thing you can do, I think, as a smith. Just invent something and just, like 3 o'clock in the morning when you just wake up screaming and, and by 9 o'clock in the morning you're holding this, little monster in your hands. It's great, right? So things like that. Tool making, I really like making good tools, that are kind of somehow, catapult themselves above being just a mere tool. So I really enjoy that. And I teach a lot. More and more, I run courses. There's some brochures here if somebody wants to pick up. So teaching has kind of been a part of what I do. Not so much financially necessarily, but I really enjoy that, and and I get a lot of satisfaction out of creating more metal addicts in the world. So yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
How long does it take you to make a knife?
I don't know because I never make just one knife. So usually I make a batch of knives, and I say, well, I'm almost completely sold out. So sometime this week I'll start another batch. So it depends how large a batch and how complex a knife and what kind of equipment breaks down. It can take me, let's say, a week to generate a decent batch of knives, something like that. It's not a clear answer, but it used to be a time when I made one knife before I was professional, and that was so long ago that, yeah.
How big is the
Again, depends on the knife, but a batch can be between 10 and, let's say, 30 knives. Depends on the complexity of the blade. Yeah.
What's your recommendation to someone who would like to apprentice?
Well, there's no such thing as apprenticeship formally in this country. You can't really be apprentice, you can be an employee. So, you have to, a lot of smiths, what they do is they take classes. That's what I did. I basically, sometimes I would work with somebody for free and learn something from them. It's easier in Japan than here, because here if I got injured and that person doesn't trust me 100%, then it can be big trouble. And it's very easy to get injured through an attention or just an accident, My friend just today was operating a forging machinery, and he got hit upside the head with a flying piece of fragmented steel. And nothing bad happened, but what if it was an apprentice? You have to have insurance, and it's the whole thing. So the easiest thing is to take a course with someone. There are people who teach. And you take a class, take another class, and then you set yourself up with a forge and an anvil and a vise. And from that point on, it kind of explodes. You start making your own tools, and go gaga, yeah.
What about when you went to Japan? How did you find the person that you apprenticed with?
How did I find? It was kind of an accident. I met a guy who had a knife store, and I was introduced to him, and he introduced me to a smith, and that went well. So that smith introduced me to another smith, and it kind of continued like that. I was basically very cheeky by Japanese standards. Sometimes I would walk into a smithing store, and kind of pretend that I didn't understand that I really shouldn't be doing this, and then something would be established, and then I would be invited. So it's good to know the language, so you can ignore the words that you know, but anyhow. So.
Well, at this point, I'd like to invite everyone to come up and ask more questions and take a closer look at the knives and tools and everything else that's up here. Next Curiosity Club is February 19th. We have Kenny McElroy of Tool, which is the Open Organization of Lockpickers. The mission of the Open Organization of Lockpickers is to advance the general public knowledge about locks and lockpicking. By examining locks, safes, and other such hardware, and by publicly discussing our findings, we hope to strip away the mystery with so many of these products are imbued. The more people know about lock technology, the better they are capable of understanding how and where certain weaknesses are present. This makes them well equipped to participate in sport picking endeavors and also helps them simply be better consumers in the marketplace, making decisions based on sound fact and research. This should be fascinating. Thanks everyone for coming.
Hey, what's up?
I just got off the work. You're down on Columbia?
Yes, I am.
Still have
By all means, take my car, give me a bus, just to make sure that I'm physically there. Awesome.
What kind of steel are you forging your hammers in?
It depends. If I want a really, really high quality